Since new information about possible life on Venus has come to light, NASA says that now is a great time to pay attention to the planet. The space agency called Venus a planet of judgment back in the 1960s, if you ever find copies of their records. In the meantime, our main goal changed to Mars. During the crazy space race, people didn't usually give the big planet such careful names. The Soviet Union was very interested in sending missions to Venus, which was a shocking world with almost no chance of life. However, the Soviet space program didn't stop working on the Venera program until the fall of the USSR. Neil deGrasse Tyson has helped us finally understand why. Come with us as we look at the Soviet Union's secret pictures taken on Venus. It was important for many reasons that the Soviet Union broke up. Not only did it change the direction of the world, but it also kept many secrets hidden. The Soviets were very good at hiding secrets. They had the most secret intelligence agency in the world and were very vague about what they could really do. It's possible that contact with aliens was one of those secrets. There are still a lot of mysteries about the past superpower. The Soviet Union was ahead of the game before the US beat most planetary trips. The USSR had a long history of both good and unsuccessful space missions. However, Venus, which is very hostile, was where it focused most of its attention. Venus is known as Venera in Russian, which is also the name of the mission that ran from 1961 to 1983. US teams were busy going to the moon at the same time. In a way, the Soviets chose to put their resources to better use somewhere else. It's not weird that people are so interested in the second world from the sun. Would the Soviets have liked to use the planet's surface as a possible power plant? Or were they planning to settle there after looking for signs of life below the surface? The question still stands. Why did the Soviets focus so much on this harsh planet while they were on these trips during the Cold War? They didn't say everything about their plans. In fact, everything we know about the trips to Venus comes from information that has been made public and not kept secret. Despite all their hard work, it's still hard to say what the Soviets were really after, and if they ever found out the secrets of Venus. They didn't just land on Venus once or twice. They did it many times. That's right, the Soviets sent 28 expensive rockets into space. Also, 13 of them went into Venus's atmosphere, and 8 of them actually landed. Because their tasks were so complicated, the Soviets were ahead of everyone else in space exploration. The US was a close second, but NASA was more interested in making satellites and new technologies than in looking for life on other worlds. The fact that they were thinking about Mars wasn't particularly strange or bad. The Soviet space program was the first to send a probe into the atmosphere of a world other than Earth. This may not be in your history book. The USSR was also the first country to successfully land a spacecraft on another world and send back pictures and sounds from the surface. Not only did the US have their own one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind time, but so did the USSR. So why don't we hear about these kinds of accomplishments more often? So, remember that we said the Soviets like to keep things secret? That's just one reason why the Soviet space program was being watched. After the fall of the USSR in 1992, the famous agency was shut down. The program had to start up again under a new Russian name, Roscosmos. A lot of its original records were lost or thrown away. This is the exact reason why we don't know why the Soviets sent 28 rockets into the atmosphere of Venus. Still, we can make the most logical guess. Maybe the Soviets chose to explore Venus because it would save them money more than anything else. That doesn't mean the space program didn't see how useful the world could be. They were looking for the right amount of water, sunlight, and general qualities of the world. It would have been very hard to figure out how hot Venus is and how thick its atmosphere is without these space trips. Many scientists today don't think that the dangerous planet could support life. It's so hot there that lead would melt, and there isn't much water. Also, Venus has about 90 times the air pressure of Earth because its atmosphere is so thick. But progress is still being made, and ignoring what the USSR did to help explore Venus would be like changing history. The Soviets thought it was important to explore Venus, but it wasn't impossible to keep the space race going by looking at other, more hospitable worlds like Mars. That cost more than sending robots to Venus. The distance between Earth and another celestial mass is what it all comes down to. Most of the time, the dangerous world is only 40 million kilometers away, while Mars is 250 million kilometers away. When distances are so different, prices are also very different. If the US didn't have the biggest economy in the world, it might not have been so easy to make trips to Mars. Several sources say that Soviet flights were dangerous and had big technical problems. It was clear that the rockets weren't ready to go very far. It was also common for the agency to lose touch with its rockets. That's why it makes sense that the Soviet space program picked a mission that would work, was cheaper, and was closer. It would be missing from the story of the Venera missions if we didn't look at the space race in this context. The US wasn't even on the map of space when Sputnik 1, the first man-made satellite, was launched by the Soviet Union in 1957. The space race began with this move and kept going. It's interesting that the US chose to focus on the Moon instead of Venus. Because NASA's trips to Venus failed over and over again in the 1960s, the US Space Agency ran into a problem called the Venus curse. Every time they sent a probe into Venus's atmosphere, it failed. At this very moment, the Soviet Union saw a chance to take advantage of NASA's mistakes. Both the US and the USSR were set on winning the space race at that time. The best plan was to take advantage of two separate chances. In a quiet but firm move, the Soviet space program claimed Earth's sister planet as its first win in the race for space, a feat that its main rival had failed to achieve. Even though the Soviet Union had few means and a government that was often unstable, they sent many missions to Venus to stay ahead of the US. Unlike NASA's focus on the Moon, this strategy choice wasn't made without any bad feelings. Also, smart advertising was used to hide their biggest mistakes with Venus. For example, the US government called Venus the evil planet and said that Mars would be the place where people would live. The Soviets didn't care about these names. Their goal was to show that they were better than the Americans, which they did. The Venera missions are almost lost in modern history, but at the start of the space age, they were very advanced, complex, and ambitious, even though they had some problems along the way. The Venera missions were in the lead. During the 1950s, the Soviets started to test the probe's designs and scientific parts. As part of the Venera program, they kept building and launching spaceships between planets for another 30 years. The Soviets worked on making their resources better because the program happened during the very bad Cold War. They were lucky that the first few years of the war gave them more resources than the US, which turned out to be very useful. It made it possible for them to make bigger rockets that could go through the air and travel long distances. The Soviets rushed to test both manned and unmanned rockets, and Soviet academics worked on a long list of calculations and reviews to make sure the Venus missions could find their way precisely. Their plans for Mars were also going on in the background. Getting better instruments for these trips was the most important thing that could have been done. In the past of space exploration, this led to big steps forward. The Soviet Union sent Venera 3 into space in 1966. It was the first man-made object to enter Venus's atmosphere and land on the planet's surface. This achievement made the competition between the two giants even stronger. There were many failures and setbacks in the American flights, but the Soviet program kept moving forward. Even though they lost, the USSR was able to send probes into Venus's atmosphere that were successful. The only problem with this method was that it didn't allow for a lot of design options. As soon as the Soviets fixed their design problems, they sent out the most advanced probes of the Venera program in the 1970s. Their innovative work led to the first launches of both the Venera 4 and the Venera 5 at the same time. Most scholars agree that this was the most important decade in the history of space travel. There's no question that the US tried to come up with similar launch plans. So why did the Soviet Space Agency choose to send rockets into Venus at the same time? In order to understand this, you need to know that traveling between planets takes high-tech tools to collect the most data and proof. At first, the robots were sent out to study the surface of the planet, which is exactly what Venera 4 did. The probe was able to enter Venus's atmosphere because the launch went well. The Soviets kept going with the program with Venera 5, but it wasn't just a copy of the first launch. The second probe was made to get very exact information about the planet. In the end, the Soviets wanted to deal with Venus's high temperatures, high air pressure, and high radiation levels. No one made them wait for a long time. By the middle of the 1970s, the Soviet program for the Venera flights had reached its most advanced stage. Up until that point, everything the USSR did was about moving forward and getting better. It was to make sure that their goals and progress were still relevant. For the second decade of the Venera missions, it was also about getting better at the methods and mechanics of traveling between planets. The Soviet Union had plans to send out teams to find out more. Venera 7 was the most amazing and exciting launch of this time. When the 11th Soviet probe entered Venus's atmosphere, it was the first spacecraft to send back information from the surface of another planet. The planet's high temperatures, density, and surface pressure had already been written down at this time. The Soviets also tried to record sounds from Venus. In the early 1980s, Venera 13 became the most complicated interplanetary journey ever. This was the next big step forward for the program. This satellite took the first panoramic pictures of the surface of Venus. At the same time, the Soviet program sent Venera 14 into space to gather similar information about the surface of the planet. The Soviet Union may have been the first country to understand how important Venus is, so the Russian Space Agency has brought back plans for trips to Venus. Venera is a project that Roscosmos and NASA are planning to work together on to study Venus's atmosphere and surface. In Russian, the name Venera means Venus. It will likely take off in the late 2020s or early 2030s. Its mission will be to study the planet's atmosphere and natural history, as well as look for signs of habitability now or in the past. The spacecraft will have an orbiter, a lander, and maybe even an inflatable to get a better look at Venus's surroundings. The Venera mission left behind a lot more than just technical achievements and world importance. When the Soviet Union started these missions during the height of the Cold War, they were the most creative and determined ways that people had ever thought of to explore the world. The Soviets kept trying to find out more about Venus, a world that was long thought to be hostile and inhospitable, even though they ran into many problems and setbacks. One of the most important things about the Venera missions was that they were the first to use unmanned probes to study the surfaces and states of other planets. These trips made it possible for people to explore beyond Earth's orbit and helped us learn about planetary science. The Venera spacecraft collected important information about Venus's harsh climate, such as its extremely high temperatures, high atmospheric pressure, and poisonous atmosphere dominated by carbon dioxide. The Venera program also made technical advances that had wider effects on space travel. For example, it led to the creation of materials that could withstand high temperatures, reliable communication systems, and good landing techniques. These achievements made it possible for later missions to go to other worlds, like Mars and beyond. The lessons learned from the Venera missions are still used to guide the design of spacecraft and the way they are operated in modern space travel. In addition to being important for science and technology, the Venera missions also had important effects on politics and culture. During the time of the space race, these missions stood for the race between superpowers to be the best at exploring space. For the Soviet Union, completing the Venera missions wasn't just about making science discoveries. It was also about showing that they were smarter and more advanced in technology than the US. The world paid close attention to each Venera journey because they knew they were important for helping people learn more about the solar system. Venera 7's soft landing on Venus in 1970 was a big deal because it was the first spaceship to send data from the surface of another planet. This accomplishment showed that the Soviet Union was able to deal with the huge problems that Venus's hard environment caused. The Venera spacecraft had scientific equipment on board as well as cameras that took the first close-up pictures of Venus's surface. Scientists learned a lot about the planet's past and development from these pictures, which showed a rough landscape with rocky plains and volcanic features. Later trips, like Venera 13 and 14, took panoramic pictures that helped us learn more about the shape and makeup of Venus's surface. Even though they had some wins, the Venera missions also had some problems and setbacks. Some trips either failed to get to Venus or ran into technical problems that stopped them from sending information back to Earth. Venus is very harsh, with temperatures above 450 degrees Celsius (842 degrees Fahrenheit) and clouds of sulfuric acid that are very corrosive. This made designing and running spaceships very difficult. Still, the hard work and drive of Soviet scientists and engineers who worked on the Venera program made it possible for future missions to Venus and other planets in the solar system. Other space agencies around the world are still exploring Venus, including NASA's upcoming trip to Venus with Roscosmos. This is a legacy of the Venera missions. The Venera project wants to build on what came before it by sending more advanced instruments to study Venus's atmosphere, surface features, and possible signs of habitability in the past or present. A group of scientists are working together on the project to find out more about Earth's nearest neighbor planet and learn more about the conditions that could support life beyond Earth.